The satellite feed crackled to life, and 70-year-old Thomas Hale stopped breathing. There, filling the massive screen at Boston Conservation Summit, stood a white lion, magnificent, scarred, and completely blind. 8 years had passed since Thomas last saw Aurelian, the abandoned cub he'd saved in South Africa. 8 years since his failing heart forced him home. 8 years of silence. "Thomas, can you hear us?" Joseph's voice echoed from Kruger Reserve, but Thomas couldn't answer. His trembling fingers found his throat, and without thinking, he began humming that old lullaby, the same one he'd sung to his dying son Michael, the same one that had calmed a terrified lion cub a lifetime ago. The blind lion froze. His massive head turned toward the screen, toward a voice traveling 10,000 miles through space. Then Aurelian released a roar, deep, primal, earth-shaking, that silenced 500 conservation experts. Thomas whispered, "My boy remembers. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story." Thomas Hale had never intended to find himself in South Africa. In 2016, at 62 years old, the retired structural engineer from Boston was running from ghosts that followed him everywhere. 2 years earlier, on July 4th, 2014, his 8-year-old son Michael had drowned at Nantucket Beach. Thomas had turned his back for 30 seconds to answer his phone, a client calling about blueprints that suddenly meant nothing. When he turned around, Michael was gone, pulled under by a riptide that gave no second chances. Margaret, his wife of 15 years, lasted 6 months after the funeral before leaving for Seattle. "I can't look at you without seeing him," she'd said, packing boxes while Thomas sat in Michael's room, holding the boy's favorite possession, an old Columbia University scarf that had belonged to Thomas's father. Michael wore it everywhere, even in summer, claiming it helped him talk to hurt animals. The boy had possessed an uncanny ability to calm any creature, humming softly while stroking fur or feathers until the fear dissolved. The grief had poisoned Thomas's heart literally. Doctors diagnosed him with stress cardiomyopathy, warning that his drinking and isolation were accelerating the damage. It was his cardiologist who suggested volunteering, something to pull him from the bottle and the darkness. That's how Thomas found himself at Kruger Conservation Reserve in March 2016, half a world away from everything that reminded him of Michael. Joseph Walker ran the reserve's rehabilitation program with military precision. The 45-year-old African-American veteran had left Alabama for South Africa after 3 tours in Afghanistan, seeking peace in the African bush. Instead, he'd found different tragedies. His 7-year-old daughter Sarah had died of malaria just a year before Thomas arrived. Where Thomas wore his grief like armor, Joseph buried his beneath routine and rules. The reserve's veterinarian, Dr. Eleanor Chen, had become controversial in conservation circles for her radical views on intervention. At 38, she'd published papers arguing that human-caused environmental changes obligated humans to help animals adapt, even if it meant interfering with natural selection. Traditional conservationists despised her. Desperate animals gave her no choice but to try. Then there was Robert Sterling, Thomas's younger brother, whose conservative talk show reached millions. Robert had built his career on brutal honesty and family values, never mentioning that he hadn't spoken to Thomas since Michael's funeral, when he'd suggested the boy's death was God's plan. These were the players assembled by fate, about to be forever changed by a blind white lion cub. March 15th, 2016 dawned with an oppressive heat that made the South African air shimmer like water. Thomas Hale had volunteered for fence patrol, the most solitary job at Kruger Conservation Reserve, because solitude was all he could bear. The date hadn't registered when he'd signed up for the shift. Only when he checked his phone at dawn did he realize 2 years exactly since Michael had slipped beneath the waves at Nantucket Beach. He drove the rust-covered Land Rover along the reserve's eastern boundary, where the fence separated protected land from cattle ranches and poacher territories. The radio crackled with routine check-ins from other volunteers, but Thomas kept his turned low. He wasn't looking for conversation or connection. He was looking for nothing, which was why he almost missed the small, white shape huddled against the fence. Thomas stopped the vehicle and rubbed his eyes. Lions weren't white, not naturally. As he approached on foot, rifle slung over his shoulder per protocol, the shape resolved into something that made his chest constrict. A lion cub, maybe 3 months old, with fur the color of fresh snow. The cub's breathing was shallow, labored. Dark stains around its eyes suggested infection or injury. Claw marks raked its haunches. Protocol demanded he radio for backup immediately. Instead, Thomas found himself kneeling in the red dirt, remembering Michael's voice. "Dad, why do animals have to be afraid of us?" The cub's eyes opened, clouded, unfocused, swimming with infection. It tried to snarl, a pitiful sound that barely disturbed the morning air. Its weakness was absolute. It couldn't even lift its head. Without thinking, Thomas began humming. The melody rose from some deep place he'd locked away, Scarborough Fair, the song his grandmother had sung to him, that he'd sung to Michael, that Michael had hummed to every injured bird and stray cat he'd ever found. The cub's struggling ceased. Its breathing deepened. When Thomas reached out slowly, telegraphing every movement, the cub didn't flinch. "What the hell are you doing?" Joseph Walker's voice cut through the moment like a blade. The rehabilitation director had arrived in his pickup, dust swirling around him as he jumped out. "You broke 17 protocols. That's a wild predator, not a house cat." "He's dying," Thomas said simply, not moving from his position. "Look at him. He's been attacked by his own pride. They reject the different ones." Joseph's expression shifted as he took in the scene, the white fur, the infected eyes, the rejection wounds. In the African sun, genetic anomalies like albinism were death sentences. Lion prides eliminated weakness, and white fur that couldn't camouflage was the ultimate weakness. "Natural selection," Joseph said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We don't interfere." "Since when is leaving a baby to die natural?" Thomas surprised himself with the vehemence in his voice. His mother didn't abandon him by choice. Look at these wounds, the pride drove them both out. She probably died defending him. Dr. Eleanor Chen arrived 15 minutes later, her medical kit bouncing against her hip as she ran from her jeep. She took one look at the cub and shook her head. Severe eye infections, dehydration, multiple infected wounds, but that's not the worst of it. She pulled out an ophthalmoscope, examining the cub's eyes carefully. This isn't just infection. There's genetic damage. Progressive retinal atrophy complicated by albinism. He's already lost maybe 70% of his vision. Within months, he'll be completely blind. "Then we put him down," Joseph said quietly. "It's the kindest thing." "Kind?" Thomas's voice broke. "Kind is giving him a chance. My son." He stopped, unable to finish. Michael had been 8. This cub was maybe 12 weeks old, both too young to die. Eleanor looked between the two men. "There's another option. He can't be released, obviously. But the reserve has provisions for educational animals, ones that help with research and awareness. I could make a case to the board." For a blind lion, Joseph's skepticism was obvious. What kind of life is that? Thomas had already made his decision. He wrapped the cub in his jacket, ignoring Joseph's protests about safety protocols. The cub weighed nothing, just fur and bones and fading life. "The kind of life where someone gives a damn," Thomas said. "I'll fund everything. Food, medical care, specialized enclosure. The reserve won't spend a penny." The drive back to the rehabilitation center was silent, except for Thomas's continued humming. The cub pressed against his chest, its breathing syncing with the melody. Joseph drove while Eleanor monitored vital signs, occasionally glancing at Thomas with an expression caught between concern and curiosity. At the center, Eleanor worked for 3 hours straight. IV fluids, antibiotics, careful cleaning of infected wounds. The cub endured it all without fighting, as if it understood these strangers were trying to help. Or perhaps it was simply too weak to resist. Thomas never stopped humming, even as his throat grew raw. "He needs a name." Eleanor said finally, exhausted. For the paperwork. Thomas looked at the white cub, remembering Michael's imaginary friend, a magical lion who lived in the clouds and protected brave children. Aurelian, he said. His name is Aurelian. It means golden. Joseph laughed bitterly. Golden, he's white as snow. Gold isn't about color, Thomas replied, stroking the sedated cub's head. It's about value. And this one's precious, even if the world can't see it. That night, against all regulations, Thomas slept on the floor beside Aurelian's enclosure. The cub woke twice, crying out in confusion and fear, both times. Thomas reached through the bars and hummed until peace returned. Joseph found them that way at dawn, an old man and a dying cub, connected by nothing more than a melody and a refusal to let go. The board meeting was scheduled for that afternoon. They would vote on Aurelian's fate treatment or euthanasia. Thomas had already called his bank, checking the balance of his retirement funds. He'd liquidate everything if necessary. Some battles were worth losing everything to fight. As morning broke, Aurelian opened his infected eyes and looked directly at Thomas. The look lasted only a moment before the cub's limited vision failed again. But Thomas saw something in that glance: recognition, trust, maybe even hope. It was the same look Michael had given him in the emergency room, just before the end, when he'd asked if animals went to the same heaven as people. Yes, Thomas whispered to Aurelian, answering a question from 2 years past. They do, but not today. Today. You stay here with me. Joseph watched from the doorway, his own ghosts stirring. His daughter Sarah had loved lions, had died clutching a stuffed one named Courage. He'd buried it with her, unable to bear the sight of it. Now, watching Thomas fight for this broken cub, Joseph felt something shift inside his carefully controlled grief. The board will say no, Joseph warned. Thomas didn't look up from Aurelian. Then I'll change their minds. How? The same way Michael changed mine every day, by believing in impossible things. The thunderstorm that hit Kruger Conservation Reserve on May 20th, 2016 was the kind that made even seasoned rangers take shelter. Lightning split the African sky like cracks in black glass, and rain fell so hard it turned the red earth into rivers of mud. Thomas Hale stood at the window of the rehabilitation center, watching nature's violence with growing dread. Somewhere in that chaos, Aurelian was experiencing his first storm in total darkness. The white lion's vision had been deteriorating rapidly over the past 2 months. Dr. Eleanor Chen had documented the progression meticulously, from 70% vision loss to 90, then 95, 3 days ago. The last glimmer of light perception had vanished. Aurelian was completely, irreversibly blind. A crash echoed from the juvenile enclosure, followed by a roar of pure terror. Thomas was running before he made the conscious decision to move, grabbing a flashlight and ignoring Joseph Walker's shouts to stop. The rain hit him like a physical force, soaking through his clothes instantly. By the time he reached Aurelian's enclosure, blood was visible even in the dim emergency lighting. The young lion was throwing himself against the walls, completely disoriented by the thunder and unable to navigate his once familiar space. Blood streamed from where he'd repeatedly hit the fence. His white fur was matted with mud and red streaks. Each lightning flash sent him careening in a different direction, roaring his confusion and fear. "Open the gate," Thomas commanded the security guard. "Sir, I can't. Protocol states, open it now or I'll climb over." The guard looked at this 62-year-old man, rain-soaked and determined, and made a decision that would later cost him his job. He opened the gate. Thomas entered the enclosure slowly, humming loudly enough to be heard over the storm. Aurelian froze, his blind eyes searching uselessly for the source of the familiar sound. Another thunderclap sent him scrambling backward, crashing into the water trough. "I'm here, boy," Thomas said, continuing to hum while moving closer. "Just like always. Follow my voice." For 14 hours, Thomas sat in that enclosure. When Aurelian panicked, Thomas hummed. When the lion cried out in confusion, Thomas answered with clicking sounds, a pattern they'd been developing over the past weeks. 2 clicks meant, "I'm here." 3 meant, "You're safe." A long whistle meant, "Come to me." By dawn, Aurelian lay pressed against Thomas's side, exhausted but calm. They'd developed an entire language in those dark hours, different patterns for different needs. Joseph found them there as the sun broke through the dissipating clouds, an old man and a blind lion covered in mud and blood, neither willing to move. "You could have been killed," Joseph said quietly. Thomas looked up, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. He was already dying, not in body, but in spirit. I know what that looks like. The security footage from that night somehow found its way onto social media 3 days later. Nobody admitted to leaking it, though Eleanor had her suspicions about a young intern whose sister was a journalist. Within 48 hours. The Man Who Tames Blind Lions had 3 million views on YouTube. The conservation community exploded. "This is everything wrong with modern conservation," wrote Dr. Marcus Hoffman, president of the Pure Wildlife Foundation, in a scathing blog post. "We are not gods. We don't get to decide which genetic failures deserve our intervention. This American tourist is playing out some white savior fantasy at the expense of scientific integrity." But for every critic, there were defenders. "Watch that footage and tell me you see exploitation," responded Maria Santos, director of Animal Compassion International. "I see a traumatized man and a traumatized animal healing each other. Since when did empathy become unwelcome in conservation?" The controversy reached its peak when Robert Sterling dedicated an entire episode of his show, Sterling Truth, to his brother's delusion. "My brother lost his son 2 years ago," Robert announced to his 3 million listeners. "Instead of getting therapy, he's in Africa projecting his grief onto a deformed lion. He's named it after my nephew's imaginary friend. For God's sake. This isn't conservation or compassion, it's mental illness being enabled by liberal feel-good politics." Thomas heard about the broadcast from Eleanor, who found him teaching Aurelian to navigate a new obstacle course using their clicking system. His hands shook as she played the clip on her phone, but his voice remained steady. "Robert never forgave me for Michael's death. Neither did I." The public attack brought unexpected consequences. The reserve's board called an emergency meeting. Thomas was banned from Aurelian's enclosure pending a full review. For 3 days, Aurelian refused to eat, pacing his enclosure while producing a low, mournful sound none of the staff had heard before. It was Joseph who broke the stalemate. On the morning of the 4th day, he walked into the board meeting uninvited and unscheduled. "You want to know something?" he announced to the stunned directors. "I've been visiting that lion too, every night after Thomas leaves. Started doing it to make sure the animal wasn't becoming dangerously dependent. But you know what I found? That blind cat knows the difference between us. He has different sounds for Thomas and different sounds for me. He's not some mindless dependent, he's forming complex social bonds." Board President Willem Kruger frowned. "That doesn't change the safety violations." "Let me finish," Joseph interrupted. "My daughter Sarah died of malaria last year. 7 years old. You all sent flowers. What you don't know is that she died holding a toy lion, asking me if lions go to heaven. I told her yes, because what else do you tell a dying child? I've been angry at God, at the world, at every happy family I see. But watching Thomas with Aurelian, it's the first thing that's made me believe my daughter's question had a real answer." He pulled out his tablet, showing videos he'd secretly recorded. "Look at this. Yesterday, we brought in a young impala with a broken leg. Normally, having a predator nearby would terrify it. But watch." The video showed Aurelian lying perfectly still while the injured impala actually approached him, as if sensing the lion posed no threat. He's not just some charity case. He could become a therapy animal for other traumatized wildlife. We could pioneer something revolutionary here. Eleanor stood up. "I support Joseph's proposal. Aurelian could help us understand how animals adapt to disabilities, how they communicate beyond visual cues. The research potential alone. This is ridiculous, interrupted Brad Morrison, the local ranch owner who joined the board as a community representative. We're talking about spending resources on a genetic dead end while healthy animals need help. Every life has value, Thomas said quietly from the doorway. Nobody had seen him arrive. He walked in carrying a worn laptop. My son Michael believed that. He had a gift with animals, could calm them with just his voice. I thought it was childish fantasy. Let me show you something. He opened the laptop and played a video from 2013. 8-year-old Michael sat in their Boston backyard with an injured crow, humming the same melody Thomas now used with Aurelian. The crow, which had been thrashing moments before, went completely still, allowing Michael to examine its broken wing. Same song, same technique, Thomas continued. I'm not projecting my son onto Aurelian. I'm continuing my son's work. Michael asked me once if animals and humans go to the same heaven. I didn't have an answer then, but if they do, it's because of moments like these when we see each other not as different species, but as fellow souls trying to survive. The room was silent. Joseph cleared his throat. Thomas showed me hours of footage like this. His boy had something special. Maybe it's genetic, maybe it's learned. But Thomas has it too, and Aurelian responds to it. We'd be fools to waste this opportunity. Willem Kruger sighed deeply. We'll vote. All in favor of allowing Thomas supervised access while we develop Joseph's therapy program proposal. 4 hands rose out of 7. Motion passes. Barely. He looked at Thomas sternly. 1 more unauthorized enclosure entry and you're banned permanently. Understood. Thomas nodded, but his attention was already elsewhere. Through the window, he could see Aurelian's enclosure. The blind lion was facing the meeting room. His unseeing eyes somehow pointed directly at Thomas, as if he'd known all along where his human was. That night, Joseph found Thomas sitting outside Aurelian's enclosure, humming softly. The African ranger sat down beside him, 2 grieving fathers in the darkness. You really think your boy sent this lion to you? Joseph asked. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, listening to Aurelian's contented rumbling. I think love doesn't die, Joseph. It just changes shape. Sometimes it becomes a memory. Sometimes it becomes a mission. And sometimes... He looked at the white lion settling down for sleep. Sometimes it becomes a second chance to get it right. Joseph pulled out his phone and showed Thomas a photo of his daughter Sarah with her toy lion. She named it Courage, said all lions were brave because they protected everyone, even when they were scared. Smart girl, Thomas whispered. Yeah, Joseph agreed, his voice thick. Maybe that's why we're here, to protect the scared and broken ones, to be the courage they can't find themselves. Thunder rumbled in the distance, another storm approaching. But this time, Aurelian didn't panic. He simply turned his blind eyes toward the sound of Thomas's humming and Joseph's presence, knowing he wasn't alone in the darkness. The viral video had started a movement. Donations poured in from around the world. Letters arrived from parents of disabled children, from veterans with PTSD, from people who saw their own brokenness in a blind white lion who refused to give up. Thomas read every letter to Aurelian during their sessions, but Robert Sterling wasn't finished. He announced he would visit South Africa personally to expose the truth about his brother's delusion. The confrontation Thomas had avoided for 2 years was coming, whether he wanted it or not. June arrived at Kruger Conservation Reserve with the dry season's dust and a peculiar sense of possibility. Thomas Hale had developed a routine that defied everything the conservation manuals prescribed. Each morning at sunrise, he would arrive at Aurelian's enclosure with coffee for himself and fresh meat for the lion. But feeding wasn't the primary purpose. Thomas was teaching a blind predator to see with his ears. Click, click, Thomas would sound, placing Aurelian's morning meal in the northwest corner. The blind lion's head would swivel precisely toward the sound, his massive paws navigating the familiar path without hesitation. 3 weeks into June, Aurelian could map his entire enclosure through sound alone, every rock, Every tree, every water source had its own acoustic signature in his mental landscape. Dr. Eleanor Chen documented everything with scientific fascination. "He's developed echolocation abilities beyond anything we've recorded in big cats," she told Thomas one morning, reviewing ultrasound readings. "His brain is actually rewiring itself, dedicating more neural pathways to auditory processing. The clicking system you developed isn't just communication, it's giving him a three-dimensional sound map." Thomas had expanded their language considerably. Short whistles meant food. Long ones meant water. A tongue trill warned of obstacles. A low hum meant all clear. But the most remarkable development was Aurelian's responses. He'd begun creating his own sounds, specific rumbles and chuffs that meant different things. Joseph Walker, who now spent evenings with both of them, had started a dictionary of what he called Aurelian's vocabulary. "Listen to that," Joseph said one evening in late June, as Aurelian produced a distinctive double purr. "He only makes that sound when he hears your truck coming. Thomas, yesterday, you were still half a mile away when he started. He knows the engine sound of your specific vehicle." The emotional bond had deepened beyond mere recognition. Aurelian had developed separation anxiety that manifested in disturbing ways. When Thomas had to skip 2 days for a supply run to Johannesburg, the lion refused all food, even from Joseph. He spent the nights pacing and producing a low, mournful call that kept the entire reserve awake. "It's not healthy," Eleanor warned. "This level of dependency is mutual." Thomas interrupted quietly. "I need him as much as he needs me." The admission hung in the air. Thomas had been sober for 3 months now, the longest stretch since Michael's death. The nightmares still came, but they were softer somehow, often ending with Aurelian's comforting presence rather than Michael's absence. It was the last day of June when Thomas brought Michael's scarf to the reserve. He hadn't planned it. The scarf had been in his backpack since he'd left Boston, a talisman he couldn't leave behind but couldn't bear to look at. That morning, Aurelian had been agitated, sensing an approaching storm system that was still hours away. Nothing seemed to calm him. Without thinking, Thomas pulled out the scarf navy blue wool with Columbia University's crown emblem, worn soft by years of a little boy's constant touch. The moment the fabric touched Aurelian's nose, the change was extraordinary. The blind lion went completely still, then began purring deeper than Thomas had ever heard. He wrapped the scarf gently around Aurelian's neck, and the lion laid down immediately, peace radiating from every muscle. "My God," Joseph breathed. "Look at him." Aurelian slept for 3 straight hours, the deepest rest he'd had since losing his sight. When he woke, he wouldn't let anyone remove the scarf. Any attempt resulted in distressed vocalizations that bordered on panic. "Scent memory," Eleanor explained, though she seemed shaken by the intensity of the response. "But this is beyond normal parameters. It's like the scarf carries emotional information he can process." The community reaction to Aurelian had become increasingly divided as July progressed. Brad Morrison, the cattle rancher who sat on the reserve board, had organized what he called Concerned Citizens for Responsible Conservation, and they met every Tuesday at his ranch, growing from 12 members to 50 by mid-July. "That American is making a mockery of everything this reserve stands for," Morrison announced at one meeting that Joseph secretly attended to gauge the opposition. "We're wasting thousands of dollars on a blind, genetic mistake while healthy animals need resources. It's emotional manipulation disguised as conservation." Morrison had begun threatening legal action, claiming misuse of conservation funds and endangerment of staff. He'd hired a lawyer from Pretoria who specialized in wildlife management disputes. The local newspaper ran dueling editorials every week, Morrison's practical arguments against what Thomas's supporters called the miracle of compassion. But for every voice of opposition, 2 rose in support. The local primary school had adopted Aurelian as an unofficial mascot. Children drew pictures of the white lion, wrote stories about him, and raised money through bake sales. The art teacher, Mrs. Deborah Hendricks, organized weekly visits where students could watch Thomas work with Aurelian from a safe distance. The most profound visit came on July 15th. Emma Rodriguez, a 9-year-old American girl visiting South Africa with her parents, had been blind since birth. Her mother had heard about Aurelian through social media and requested a special visit. The reserve board reluctantly agreed, with strict safety protocols. Thomas will never forget the moment Emma's small hand touched Aurelian's mane through the fence. The lion, who usually shied from strangers, pressed against the barrier, purring so loudly it sounded like a motor. Emma laughed bright, pure joy that made every adult present tear up. "He knows I can't see either," Emma said simply. "We're the same." She began humming not Thomas's melody, but her own song. Aurelian responded with a sound none of them had heard before, a high, almost musical note that seemed to harmonize with the child's voice. For 20 minutes, a blind girl and a blind lion sang together while the African sun painted everything gold. Emma's mother, Patricia Rodriguez, started a social media campaign that night. Aurelian and Emma went viral within days. Donations poured in from around the world. A children's book publisher reached out about telling their story. The attention was overwhelming, but it also drew unwanted scrutiny. Robert Sterling announced on his show that he would personally travel to South Africa in August to investigate this exploitation of childhood disability for publicity. He'd partnered with a documentary crew known for exposé work, planning a piece called When Grief Becomes Delusion, the Thomas Hale story. "He's my brother," Robert told his audience. "I love him, which is why I can't stand by while he descends into madness. He's projecting his dead son onto an animal, and now he's dragging innocent children into his fantasy. Someone has to intervene." Thomas heard the broadcast in Joseph's office, his hands trembling as Robert's voice filled the room. "He never forgave me," Thomas said quietly. "When Michael died, Robert said it was my fault. Said if I'd been a better father, more present instead of always working, it wouldn't have happened. Maybe he was right." Joseph switched off the broadcast. "Your brother's an ass. Sorry, but it's true. I've watched you with Aurelian for months now. This isn't projection or delusion. It's love. Pure, complicated, healing love." August arrived with unusual heat and the promise of confrontation. Robert's arrival was scheduled for August 10th. Thomas tried to maintain normalcy, but Aurelian sensed his anxiety. The lion became increasingly protective, positioning himself between Thomas and any perceived threat, even growling when unfamiliar staff approached too quickly. On August 7th, Joseph finally shared what he'd been holding back for months. They were sitting outside Aurelian's enclosure at sunset, watching the blind lion navigate his space with increasing confidence. "Sarah died on a Tuesday," Joseph said suddenly. 3 in the afternoon. The fever had been so high for so long that she didn't recognize me at the end, but she held on to her toy lion courage. She called it. Her last words were asking if lions remembered the children who loved them. Thomas remained silent, knowing Joseph needed to speak. "I told her yes, they remember forever. Then I held her while she died. That stupid toy lion between us. I buried it with her because I couldn't stand seeing it. But watching you with Aurelian, it's like seeing proof that I didn't lie to my baby girl. Maybe they do remember. Maybe love transcends species and death and all the logical boundaries we put up." Joseph pulled out his phone, showing Thomas a video he'd taken the night before. Aurelian was sleeping, but his paws were moving, running in his dreams. He's not trapped in darkness. Thomas, whatever world he's seeing in his mind, he's free in it. You gave him that. August 9th started like any other day. Thomas arrived at sunrise, began their morning routine of clicks and calls. He'd started reading to Aurelian engineering manuals mostly, technical texts about stress loads and structural integrity. The lion seemed to find his voice soothing regardless of content. The tensile strength of steel varies with carbon content, Thomas read, while Aurelian lounged nearby, Michael's scarf still wrapped around his neck. Higher carbon percentages increase strength but reduce ductility. The pain hit like lightning, sharp and crushing, radiating from his chest down his left arm. The book fell from Thomas's hands as he collapsed against the fence. His vision blurred, heart rhythm chaotic and wrong. Aurelian's reaction was immediate. The blind lion roared not in aggression but in pure distress, throwing himself against the fence trying to reach Thomas. His calls brought Joseph running from the office, Eleanor from the medical station. "Heart attack," Eleanor confirmed, already on her radio calling for the helicopter. "We need immediate evacuation." As they loaded Thomas onto a stretcher, Aurelian's distress escalated to self-harm. He began hitting his head against the fence posts, his roars becoming screams. Joseph had to physically restrain himself from entering the enclosure. The helicopter ride to Johannesburg General took 40 minutes. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness. But one thought persisted: Aurelian would think he'd been abandoned. The lion would wait for footsteps that wouldn't come, listen for a voice that remained silent. "Tell him," Thomas gasped to Joseph before they loaded him into the aircraft. "Tell him I'm coming back." Joseph nodded, but they both knew it might be a promise Thomas couldn't keep. For 72 hours, Aurelian refused all interaction. He wouldn't eat, wouldn't respond to Joseph's attempts at their clicking language, wouldn't move from the corner where Thomas had collapsed. The blind lion was shutting down, withdrawing into a darkness deeper than mere blindness. Eleanor monitored his vital signs with growing alarm. "His heart rate is dropping, body temperature declining. It's like he's willing himself to die." On the third night, Joseph made a desperate decision. He called Thomas's hospital room in Johannesburg, where the engineer was recovering from emergency surgery. Thomas was weak but conscious. "Put the phone to his ear," Thomas whispered to Joseph over the satellite connection. Joseph entered Aurelian's enclosure against all protocols. Holding the phone near the lion's ear, Thomas's voice came through, thin but clear, humming Scarborough Fair. Aurelian's blind eyes snapped open. He lifted his massive head, releasing a sound that was part roar, part cry, part recognition. When the humming stopped, he took his first drink of water in 3 days. "Every day," Thomas told Joseph afterward. "Call me every day. Let me talk to him." Robert Sterling arrived the next morning. Documentary crew in tow, ready to expose his brother's delusion. He found Joseph sitting beside a blind white lion wearing a child's scarf, holding a phone playing Thomas's voice. The scene was so far from what he'd expected that, for once, Robert had no words. "Your brother saved this animal," Joseph said without looking up. "And this animal saved your brother. If you can't see that, you're the one who's blind." Robert approached the fence slowly, his camera crew filming every step. Aurelian turned toward the new presence, nostrils flaring to catch the scent. Then the blind lion did something unexpected. He moved toward Robert, not aggressively, but curiously, as if recognizing something familiar in the stranger's scent. "He smells Thomas on you," Joseph explained. "Your brothers. Your scent signatures are similar." Robert stood frozen as Aurelian pressed against the fence, producing the double purr he usually reserved for Thomas. The conservative talk show host, known for his cutting words and harsh judgments, found himself reaching through the barrier to touch the lion's mane. "He's really blind," Robert said quietly, his carefully constructed narrative crumbling. "Completely," Joseph confirmed. "And your brother taught him to live anyway, taught him that darkness doesn't mean hopelessness." The documentary crew continued filming, but Robert knew the story had changed. This wasn't about delusion or projection anymore. This was about two broken beings, a grieving father and a blind lion finding a reason to keep living in each other. "How long until Thomas can return?" Robert asked. "Weeks, maybe months. His heart's damaged. The altitude here. The stress, it might be too much." Robert made a decision that would have shocked his audience. "I'll stay until Thomas comes back. I'll help with Aurelian." Joseph stared at him. "You know anything about lions?" "No," Robert admitted, "but I know about brothers, and maybe it's time I learned about forgiveness." August ended with an unusual scene at Kruger Conservation Reserve. Conservative talk show host Robert Sterling sitting beside a blind white lion, reading engineering manuals over a satellite phone while his brother listened from a hospital bed 1,000 miles away. The lion wore a child's university scarf and purred at the sound of both brothers' voices, no longer distinguishing between them. The viral videos continued. Aurelian update trended globally. Donations reached six figures. Plans for Aurelian's Academy began taking shape, a revolutionary facility for disabled wildlife rehabilitation. But none of that mattered as much as the nightly phone calls, where Thomas would hum, Aurelian would purr, and love traveled through satellites and space to prove that distance couldn't break what trauma had forged. October 3rd, 2016, began with an emergency board meeting that would determine Aurelian's fate. Thomas Hale sat in the conference room at Kruger Conservation Reserve, still pale from his heart surgery 6 weeks earlier, his cardiologist's warnings ringing in his ears. He shouldn't have been there. The altitude, the stress, the travel from Johannesburg were all against medical orders. But some battles couldn't be fought from hospital beds. Willem Kruger, the board president, didn't waste time with pleasantries. We've received an offer from the Beijing Wildlife Exhibition Center, $500,000 for Aurelian. They're specifically interested in him because white lions are considered symbols of prosperity in Chinese culture. The blindness actually adds to his value. They're marketing it as the lion who sees with his heart. Thomas felt the room spin slightly but gripped the table to stay steady. He's not for sale. Mr. Hale, Brad Morrison interrupted, his cattle rancher's pragmatism sharp as barbed wire. You've spent 4 months and God knows how much money on one defective animal. That $500,000 could fund the reserve's anti-poaching unit for 3 years. How many healthy animals would that save? The math was irrefutable. Thomas knew it. Everyone in the room knew it. But mathematics had never saved a soul or healed a heart. Furthermore, Morrison continued, pulling out a folder, I've had my lawyer review the reserve's charter. Educational animals, which is Aurelian's only legal classification since he can't be released, must demonstrate quantifiable conservation value within 6 months of acquisition. Aurelian's been here 7 months. Where's the value? Dr. Eleanor Chen spoke up. The research value alone has produced 3 papers that no one outside academia reads. Morrison cut her off. Meanwhile, we're paying for specialized food, custom enclosure modifications, round-the-clock care. It's unsustainable. Robert Sterling, who'd extended his stay after witnessing Aurelian's connection to Thomas's scent, surprised everyone by speaking. The publicity value has been enormous. Donations have increased 300% since Aurelian's story went viral. Temporary spike, Morrison dismissed. Internet attention spans are 15 seconds. In 6 months, no one will remember a blind lion in Africa. Willem Kruger raised his hand for silence. The board has discussed this extensively. Mr. Hale, we're giving you 30 days to present a concrete, sustainable plan for Aurelian that demonstrates clear conservation value. If you cannot, we'll accept Beijing's offer. The money will do more good than sentiment. 30 days, Thomas repeated, his mind already racing despite his body's weakness. And if I create something revolutionary, then we'll vote again, Willem said, though his expression suggested he thought it impossible. Meeting adjourned. As the board members filed out, Morrison stopped beside Thomas. It's not personal, Hale. It's practical. That lion is a luxury this reserve can't afford. Every life that's loved is a luxury, Thomas replied quietly. The question is whether we're too poor in spirit to afford compassion. The news of the ultimatum leaked within hours. Emma Rodriguez's mother, Patricia, had connections in wildlife journalism, and by evening, the story was trending globally. #SaveAurelian exploded across social media. The 9-year-old blind girl who'd sung with Aurelian recorded a video that would be viewed 40 million times in 48 hours. Adults think different means broken, Emma said directly to the camera, her unseeing eyes somehow finding viewers' hearts. They want to sell Aurelian because he's blind. Would they sell me too? He taught me that darkness isn't scary when you're not alone. Please don't let them take him away. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. The reserve's website crashed from traffic. Phone lines jammed with calls from around the world. Donations poured in small amounts from children who'd emptied piggy banks. Large sums from celebrities touched by Emma's plea. But Willem Kruger held firm. Money isn't the issue anymore. It's the principle. We're a conservation reserve, not a sanctuary for pets. Aurelian needs to serve a conservation purpose. Thomas knew traditional arguments wouldn't work. He needed something unprecedented. At 2 in the morning on October 7th, inspiration struck. He called Joseph Walker. Therapy, Thomas said without preamble. Not for humans, for animals. Aurelian could be the world's first trauma rehabilitation lion. Joseph's silence lasted so long, Thomas thought the connection had dropped. Then, you want to use a blind lion to help other traumatized animals? Think about it. His enclosure is the calmest spot in the reserve. He can't hunt, so prey animals don't fear him instinctively. He survived trauma himself. Rejection, blindness, abandonment, maybe recognition of suffering transcends species. It's insane, Joseph said. Then, after a pause, it's so insane it might work. They had 3 weeks to prove the impossible. Joseph identified their test cases with careful deliberation. First was Kessie, a female baboon who'd watched her entire troop massacred by poachers. She'd been caught in a snare for 2 days before rescue, and now exhibited severe PTSD, self-mutilation, food refusal, and constant distress calls. No rehabilitation approach had worked. Second came Django, a leopard cub with only 3 legs after a hyena attack that killed his mother. The reserve had saved his life, but he'd given up trying to move, lying in his enclosure with dead eyes, waiting to die. Third was Amara, a martial eagle with a permanently damaged wing from a power line collision. She could never fly again, and had responded by refusing to perch, lying on the ground in surrender to earthbound fate. October 15th marked day 1 of what Joseph privately called the Miracle Month. They modified Aurelian's enclosure, creating separate but visible spaces for each traumatized animal. The blind lion's initial reaction was unexpected. He showed no aggression or territorial behavior. Instead, he oriented toward each new presence with what could only be described as curiosity. Kessie was the first breakthrough. The traumatized baboon, placed in a secure area 20 feet from Aurelian, initially screamed in terror, but Aurelian did something remarkable. He lay down with his blind eyes facing her direction and began purring the deep, continuous rumble Thomas recognized as his self-soothing mechanism. For 6 hours, the blind lion simply lay there, purring. Gradually, Kessie's screams became whimpers, then silence. By day 3, she was watching Aurelian navigate his blindness with what looked like recognition. When he successfully used Thomas's clicking system to find his food, Kessie made a soft sound, the first non-distress vocalization she'd produced since the massacre. "She's seeing him overcome," Eleanor observed, documenting everything. "A blind predator surviving despite his limitation. It's giving her permission to survive too." Django proved more challenging. The 3-legged leopard cub wouldn't even look at Aurelian initially. But on October 20th, something shifted. Aurelian was practicing his obstacle navigation when he stumbled, a rare occurrence anymore. Instead of immediately recovering, he stayed down for a moment, then slowly, deliberately, got up and tried again. Thomas watched Django watching Aurelian. The cub's eyes tracked every movement as the blind lion failed, recovered, and succeeded. That afternoon, Django stood for the first time in weeks. He fell immediately, but like Aurelian, he tried again. "He's teaching by example," Robert said, having become an unexpected ally in the project. "Not through dominance or instruction, just by being." The eagle, Amara, remained the holdout. She lay on the ground, magnificent wings folded in defeat. Aurelian seemed particularly drawn to her, spending hours lying as close to her enclosure area as possible. On October 25th, he did something that stunned everyone. Aurelian began making a new sound, a high, keening call unlike any lion vocalization in Thomas's experience. It sounded almost like a bird's cry. Amara's head snapped up, the first real movement she'd made in days. The blind lion continued the strange call, and impossibly, the eagle responded with her own cry. "They're communicating." Eleanor breathed, recording frantically. Cross-species vocalization. This is unprecedented. By October 28th, the transformations were undeniable. Kessie had begun grooming herself again and was taking food regularly. She'd positioned her sleeping area to maintain visual contact with Aurelian. When the lion successfully navigated challenges, she would make encouraging sounds. Django had progressed to walking short distances on 3 legs, falling less each day. Most remarkably, he'd begun playing batting at enrichment toys, pouncing on shadows. The reserve staff noticed he only played when Aurelian was active, as if the blind lion's movement gave him permission to move too. Amara had begun perching on a low branch, though she still couldn't fly. She'd developed a routine of calling to Aurelian each morning, and he would answer with his strange bird-like sound. The interspecies morning greeting had become so reliable that staff set their watches by it. October 31st arrived with the kind of African sunrise that made the world look newly made. The board gathered at Aurelian's expanded enclosure to witness what Thomas and Joseph had built in 30 days. Willem Kruger maintained his skepticism until he saw it himself, a blind lion lying peacefully, while a traumatized baboon groomed near him, a 3-legged leopard cub playing in sight of a natural predator, and a grounded eagle perched proudly despite her useless wing. "How?" Willem asked simply. Thomas, still weak but determined, explained. "Trauma recognizes trauma. Aurelian can't see their injuries, but he senses their pain. He's not trying to fix them. He's showing them that broken doesn't mean worthless. They're teaching each other that survival isn't about being whole, it's about adapting." Eleanor presented her data. Cortisol levels in all 3 animals had dropped significantly. Appetite had returned. Self-harm behaviors had ceased. More importantly, each animal had developed its own relationship with Aurelian, distinct vocalizations and interaction patterns that suggested complex emotional bonds. Brad Morrison wasn't convinced. "This is touching, but it's not conservation. It's a petting zoo for damaged goods." "No," Joseph interjected forcefully. "It's revolutionary. Do you know how many animals we euthanize because trauma makes them unreleasable? How many conservation programs fail because we can't rehabilitate psychological damage? Aurelian isn't just helping 3 animals. He's pioneering a completely new approach to wildlife rehabilitation." The debate raged for 2 hours. Morrison argued finances and tradition. Willem questioned long-term viability. Other board members wavered between pragmatism and possibility. Finally, Willem called for the vote. All in favor of continuing Aurelian's program with a 6-month review, 4 hands rose, Morrison and 2 others opposed. By a single vote, Aurelian's fate was decided. "There's one condition," Willem added, looking directly at Thomas. "Your heart can't take this altitude and stress long term. Your doctors have been clear. Joseph becomes primary caregiver. You can advise, visit when medically cleared, but day-to-day care transfers immediately." Thomas felt his chest tighten not from his damaged heart, but from impending loss. He looked at Aurelian, the blind lion who'd become his reason to wake each morning, his bridge back from the abyss of grief. "He won't understand," Thomas said quietly. "He'll think I abandoned him." "He'll adapt," Morrison said coldly. "According to your theory, that's what survivors do." That night, Thomas sat with Aurelian for what they both somehow knew was a farewell. The lion pressed against the fence, Michael's scarf still around his neck, purring deeply while Thomas hummed their song. Kessie watched from her area, making soft, sad sounds. Django stopped playing. Even Amara was silent. "I'm not leaving you," Thomas whispered, though they both knew it was a lie circumstances demanded. "Joseph will be here. You'll help more animals. You'll change the world, just like Michael always believed animals could." November 1st dawned with Thomas's departure for Johannesburg. As his truck pulled away, Aurelian released a roar that echoed across the reserve, not angry or aggressive, but mournful, knowing. It was the sound of another goodbye, Another loss. Another test of whether love could survive separation. The other animals responded Casey's cries, Django's whimpers, Amara's screech, a chorus of creatures who understood abandonment singing farewell to the man who'd proven that broken beings could still heal each other. Robert drove his brother to the airport, neither speaking until they reached the gate. "I was wrong," Robert said simply. "About everything. The lion, you, Michael's death. Forgive me." Thomas gripped his brother's hand. "Already done. Take care of him for me." "Joseph will. But I'll visit. Send videos. Make sure he knows you haven't forgotten." As Thomas's plane lifted off, Aurelian stood in his enclosure, blind eyes facing northeast toward Johannesburg, toward Boston, toward a love that distance couldn't diminish. Joseph stood beside him, and together, a grieving ranger and a blind lion, they began building a legacy that would change how the world understood healing. November 1st, 2016 arrived with the kind of harsh clarity that African mornings deliver to those who must say goodbye. Thomas Hale stood at Aurelian's enclosure at 4 a.m., 3 hours before his mandatory departure for Johannesburg, his damaged heart beating irregularly against his ribs. The ultimatum from his cardiologist had been absolute return to sea level immediately, or face catastrophic cardiac failure within weeks. "The altitude is killing you," Dr. Pretorius had said bluntly during yesterday's emergency consultation. "Your ejection fraction is down to 30%. Every day you remain here takes months off your life. This isn't a negotiation. Mr. Hale, leave now or die here." Aurelian sensed the finality. The blind lion hadn't eaten for 2 days, somehow knowing that their routine was ending. He pressed his massive body against the fence where Thomas sat, Michael's scarf still wrapped around his neck, now worn and faded from months of African sun. The lion's purring had a different quality, desperate, clinging, as if the vibration could somehow anchor Thomas to this place. "I'm not choosing to leave you," Thomas whispered, his hand through the fence, fingers buried in Aurelian's white mane. "God knows if I could trade my heart for more time, I would. But maybe that's what I've been doing all along, trading my heart, piece by piece, for these moments with you." Joseph Walker arrived with coffee and silence, understanding that words would cheapen this farewell. He'd promised to record everything, to maintain the clicking language, to ensure Aurelian never felt abandoned. But both men knew the truth. Primary caregivers couldn't be replaced like worn equipment. "He stopped eating when you were in the hospital," Joseph said quietly. "He'll do it again." "Then don't let him," Thomas replied, though his voice broke. "Force feed if necessary. Sedate him. Do whatever it takes. He has to survive this. The other animals need him now." Kessie, the traumatized baboon, watched from her area, making soft distress calls. She'd learned to read Aurelian's moods, and his current anguish was triggering her own anxiety. Django, the three-legged leopard cub, had stopped his morning play routine, sitting still as stone. Even Amara, the grounded eagle, was silent. Thomas pulled out his phone and played a recording Michael's voice from 3 years ago, talking to an injured sparrow. "It's okay to be scared," the boy's voice said. "Everyone gets scared, but scared isn't the same as alone." He'd played this recording for Aurelian dozens of times, and the lion always responded with a specific rumble, as if answering the child who was no longer there. "Keep playing this for him," Thomas told Joseph, "every day, so he knows the connection isn't broken, just stretched." At 6:47 a.m., Robert Sterling arrived with the truck that would take Thomas to the airport. The conservative talk show host had extended his stay another week, claiming he needed more footage for his documentary, though everyone knew he was trying to repair 8 years of fraternal damage. "We need to go," Robert said gently. "Your flight." "I know." Thomas stood slowly, his legs unsteady. He'd lost 30 pounds during his recovery, and his clothes hung loose on his frame. "One more minute." He pressed his forehead against the fence, humming Scarborough Fair one final time. Aurelian responded with the deep harmonic purr he'd developed specifically for this song. Then, As Thomas turned to leave, the blind lion did something he'd never done before. He roared. Not the distress call from August when Thomas had his heart attack, but something else, a sound that seemed to say, "I know you have to go, but I refuse to accept it." Thomas collapsed 2 steps from the enclosure, not from his heart, but from the weight of leaving. Robert caught him, held him while he sobbed, the first time he'd truly cried since Michael's funeral. Aurelian continued roaring, the sound carrying across the reserve, bringing staff running. "Get him out of here," Joseph told Robert. "Quick, before this gets worse." As the truck pulled away, Thomas watched through the rear window as Aurelian threw himself against the fence, over and over, blind eyes searching for something he'd never see again. The last image Thomas had was Joseph entering the enclosure, trying to calm a lion whose heart was breaking in real time. The flight to Boston required a medical escort and 2 stops for oxygen. Margaret, his ex-wife, met him at Logan Airport, their first meeting since the divorce. She took one look at him and gasped, "Jesus, Tom, you look like death." "I left him," Thomas said, the only explanation he could manage. "I left him just like I left Michael in the water." Margaret drove him to Mass General, where he would spend the next 3 weeks in cardiac rehabilitation. The medical team saved his body, but his spirit remained in Africa with a blind white lion who was, according to Joseph's daily emails, refusing all comfort. For 3 days. Aurelian didn't move from the spot where Thomas had said goodbye. He wouldn't eat, wouldn't respond to Joseph's attempts at their clicking language, wouldn't acknowledge the other animals. On the 4th day, Joseph made an executive decision that violated Thomas's explicit instructions. He stopped sending updates. "It's better this way," Joseph wrote in his final email. "You need to heal. He needs to accept. We'll manage." But management and acceptance were different things. Aurelian slowly returned to functional existence, but the light, metaphorical though it was, for a blind lion had gone out. He performed his role with the traumatized animals mechanically, without the intuitive empathy that had made him magical. He ate just enough to survive. He slept constantly. Thomas, meanwhile, descended into the deepest depression of his life. Back in his empty Boston apartment, surrounded by photos of Michael and printouts of Aurelian, he wrote obsessively, filling notebooks with letters he couldn't send, memories he couldn't share. He started a book about their experience, but every sentence felt like betrayal, reducing something sacred to mere words. Robert tried to help, visiting weekly with updates from his South African contacts, but he made the mistake of showing Thomas a video from December 2016, Aurelian lying motionless in his enclosure, not even responding when Django playfully pounced near him. "He's given up," Thomas said flatly. "I killed his spirit." "He's adapting," Robert argued, though he didn't believe it himself. "You said that's what survivors do." Christmas 2016 passed unmarked. Thomas's heart physically improved, his ejection fraction rose to 40%, but his will deteriorated. He'd saved Aurelian only to abandon him. He'd repeated his greatest failure, leaving another soul he loved to face the darkness alone. Meanwhile, at Kruger Reserve, Joseph struggled to maintain Aurelian's program. The blind lion still helped other traumatized animals, 7 more cases by March 2017, but mechanically, without joy. He'd developed a new behavior that broke Joseph's heart every sunset. Aurelian would face northeast, toward Boston, and remain motionless for exactly 1 hour, as if waiting for something that never came. Years passed in parallel loneliness. 2017 became 2018, then 2019. Thomas had 2 more cardiac episodes, each leaving him weaker. He published his book, The Lion Who Saw in the Dark, which became a minor bestseller, but success felt hollow. Every interview, every reading, every praise for the beautiful story felt like exploitation of something pure, Aurelian. According to the rare updates Joseph allowed through, had become legendary in conservation circles. By 2020, he'd helped rehabilitate 43 traumatized animals. Academic papers were written about the Aurelian effect, how a disabled animal could facilitate healing in others. The Chinese offer had risen to $1 million, but the reserve, now flooded with donations, always declined. Thomas tried repeatedly to return to South Africa. Each time, his cardiologist threatened to have him declared mentally incompetent if he attempted the journey. The altitude would kill him within days. Video calls were suggested but rejected. Joseph believed seeing Thomas without being able to touch him would cause Aurelian more harm than good. 2021 brought COVID-19 and complete isolation. Thomas couldn't even get updates, as South Africa locked down completely. He spent the pandemic alone, talking to a photo of Aurelian, playing recordings of the lion's various vocalizations, slowly accepting he would die without seeing him again. By 2023, Thomas was 70, using a wheelchair more than walking. His heart function had stabilized but not improved. Robert had made peace with their past, even dedicating several shows to wildlife conservation. But nothing eased Thomas's essential grief. He'd found redemption in Africa only to lose it to the frailty of his own body. The cruelest part was knowing Aurelian was alive, but unreachable. Joseph had finally resumed contact, sending brief notes. He's well, still helping others, still faces northeast at sunset. Never videos, never photos, never details that would make the separation real. 2024 arrived with Thomas in hospice care, his heart finally failing beyond repair. He'd made peace with dying, but not with dying separated from Aurelian. In his lucid moments, he wrote final letters to the lion he'd never see again, letters that would never be delivered, words of love that would remain unheard. It was in this state, dying, alone, filled with regret, that Thomas received an unexpected call. The Boston Conservation Summit wanted him as their keynote speaker for December 2024. They'd read his book, followed Aurelian's story, and believed his message about traumatized beings healing each other needed to be heard. "I'm dying," Thomas told them bluntly. "We know," the organizer replied. "That's why it matters." December 15th, 2024 arrived with unusual warmth for a Boston winter. Thomas Hale, 70 years old and confined to a wheelchair, sat backstage at the Conservation Summit, oxygen tubes running beneath his nose, hands trembling not from illness but from a nervousness he couldn't explain. Something about today felt different, charged with possibility he didn't dare name. The summit organizer, Dr. Patricia Walsh, had been oddly insistent about technical details. "We're having some satellite connections," she'd mentioned casually. "Wildlife reserves around the world will be watching. Your story inspired programs globally." Thomas had prepared a simple speech about compassion in conservation, though every word felt inadequate. How could he explain that saving Aurelian had saved him, only to lose them both to the tyranny of distance and dying hearts? "5 minutes, Mr. Hale," a technician announced, then added strangely, "The South African connection is stable." "South African?" Thomas asked, but the technician had already hurried away. Robert wheeled him onto the stage to thunderous applause. 500 conservation experts, wildlife advocates, and journalists filled the auditorium. On the massive screen behind him, the summit's logo glowed. Thomas began speaking, his voice thin but steady. 8 years ago, I found a blind lion cub dying against a fence in South Africa. I was dying too, though I didn't know it yet, dying of grief, of guilt, of the terrible weight of outliving your child." He paused, gathering strength. "That lion and I saved each other, not in some metaphorical sense, but literally. He gave me purpose. I gave him possibility. Together, we proved that broken doesn't mean worthless." The screen behind him flickered. Thomas continued, unaware. "The cruelest irony is that my broken heart, literally damaged, forced me to abandon him. For 8 years, I've lived knowing he's alive, thriving even, but thinking I've been forgotten. That's the price of salvation sometimes. You save something beautiful, then watch it continue without you." "Thomas," Dr. Walsh interrupted gently, "there's something you need to see." The screen came alive with a satellite feed. Thomas's breath stopped. There, in crystal clear resolution, was Aurelian's enclosure at Kruger Reserve. The blind lion, magnificent and scarred, sat facing the camera, around his neck, faded but unmistakable, was Michael's Columbia University scarf. "Hello, Thomas." Joseph Walker's voice filled the auditorium. "I've got something to tell you, and I need 500 witnesses so you'll believe it." Thomas couldn't speak. His eyes locked on Aurelian, who had lifted his head at the sound of voices through the speakers. "I lied to you," Joseph continued. "For 8 years, I've been lying. I told you Aurelian adapted, moved on, forgot. The truth is, he's never forgotten a single day. Every sunset for 8 years. He's faced northeast toward Boston. He's slept with Michael's scarf every night. When new traumatized animals arrive, the first thing he teaches them is the clicking language you created." The auditorium was silent except for Thomas's ragged breathing. "But that's not all," Joseph said. "Aurelian saved 47 animals over these years. And he's done something else. Something I didn't believe until I saw it myself. He's been teaching them about you." On screen, Joseph made a clicking sound, 2 short, 3 long. Immediately, not just Aurelian, but 3 other lions, 2 leopards, and a cheetah responded, turning toward the camera. "Every animal that comes through Aurelian's program learns this call," Joseph explained. "It means the one who comes back. They're all waiting for you. Thomas, they've been waiting 8 years. Thomas found his voice, weak and breaking. "Aurelian." The blind lion's reaction was instant. His massive head snapped toward the speakers, and he released a roar that made the summit audience gasp, not aggressive but recognition, pure and absolute. Without thinking, Thomas began humming Scarborough Fair. Aurelian rose to his feet, moving toward the camera with purpose despite his blindness. He pressed his face against something off-screen. Joseph later revealed it was a projection screen they'd installed showing Thomas's image, though Aurelian couldn't see it. The lion began his deep, harmonic purr, the one Thomas hadn't heard in 8 years. "There's more," Joseph said, his own voice thick with emotion. "Aurelian, show him." The blind lion turned and made a specific call, 3 short chirps. From off-camera, a young lion appeared, also white, also blind, maybe 6 months old. The cub moved confidently despite its blindness, using the clicking navigation system with practiced ease. "This is Tommy," Joseph said. "The local children named him after you. He was born blind, rejected by his mother. Aurelian claimed him 5 months ago. He's teaching Tommy everything you taught him, the clicks, the calls, even the humming. Yesterday, I caught Aurelian grooming Tommy while purring the tune of Scarborough Fair." Thomas was crying openly now, not caring about the audience or cameras. "You kept our song," he whispered. "He kept everything," Joseph confirmed. "Your techniques are now standard protocol for blind predator rehabilitation worldwide. The Aurelian method has saved dozens of animals that would have been euthanized, and every single one knows your click signature." Joseph made another sound, and Tommy, the blind cub, responded with a perfect imitation of the double click that meant, "I'm here." "He's never forgotten," Joseph said. "And neither have we. Thomas, what you built didn't end when you left. It grew. It spread. It's saving lives across Africa." The summit erupted in applause, but Thomas heard none of it. He was watching Aurelian teach Tommy the morning navigation routine, using the exact clicking patterns Thomas had developed. The blind leading the blind, love teaching love across impossible darkness. "Can he hear me?" Thomas asked. "Every word," Joseph confirmed. Thomas leaned toward the microphone. "Aurelian, my boy, I'm still here. I've always been here. You were never forgotten, never abandoned. You were held in my heart every second of every day. And you magnificent soul, you've been holding me in yours." Aurelian roared again, and this time Tommy joined him, a smaller, higher echo of recognition. 2 blind lions calling across continents to the man who'd proven that love transcends distance, time, and even sight itself. The applause in the Boston auditorium continued for 3 full minutes, but Thomas Hale heard only Aurelian's purring through the satellite connection. The blind lion had settled in front of the camera with young Tommy pressed against his side, teaching by proximity what couldn't be taught in words, that love persists across any distance. "Before we lose the connection," Thomas said, his voice stronger than it had been in years, "I need to announce something." He looked directly at the camera, speaking to Aurelian though the lion couldn't see him. "The Michael's Pride Foundation begins today. Joseph, you'll be the African director. We're going to build Aurelian's Academy into a global model for trauma rehabilitation through interspecies healing." Robert Sterling stepped to the microphone. "I'm pledging my first year's salary as board member to the foundation. 8 years ago, I called my brother delusional for loving this lion. I was the delusional one, blind to what real love looks like." Within minutes, pledges flooded in from the audience. $3 million committed before the satellite feed ended. The last image was Aurelian facing northeast, toward Boston, with Tommy mimicking his position perfectly, 2 blind lions pointing like compasses toward their true north. Monthly video calls began immediately. Every third Sunday, Thomas would connect with Kruger Reserve. He'd read engineering manuals while Aurelian purred. He'd hum Scarborough Fair while Tommy learned to harmonize. He watched Aurelian train 7 more blind cubs over the spring of 2025, each one learning the clicking language that had become their shared heritage. By June 2025, Thomas knew his time was running out. His heart function had dropped below 20%. Hospice nurses monitored him constantly. But on June 15th, the summer solstice, he insisted on one final call. Aurelian was 13 years old now, massive and magnificent despite his blindness. Tommy had grown strong beside him. 17 other rescued animals filled the expanded enclosure, all touched by Aurelian's patient presence. Joseph held the camera steady as Thomas appeared on screen. "My boy," Thomas whispered, barely audible. "My beautiful, brave boy. You taught me that darkness isn't about what we can't see. It's about what we refuse to feel. You felt everything. You saved everyone. You remembered when I thought you'd forgotten." Aurelian rose and walked to the screen, pressing his scarred face against it. He purred deep, constant, eternal. "Michael would have loved you," Thomas continued. "Maybe he sent you. Maybe love just finds its way. Thank you for showing me the way back to the light." Thomas hummed Scarborough Fair one last time, his voice fading in and out. Aurelian harmonized, and Tommy joined them, 3 voices across space and species, singing goodbye. October 2025 arrived with unusual rains at Kruger Reserve. Joseph found Aurelian at dawn on October 10th, lying in his usual spot facing northeast. Tommy was pressed against him, Michael's scarf between them. The old lion wasn't breathing. "He went peacefully," Joseph reported to Robert. "No struggle, no pain, just completion." Later that day, Robert opened the letter Thomas had left to be read after both their deaths. "Aurelian taught me that blindness can be a gift. It forces us to trust, to feel, to love without seeing. My son Michael asked if animals and humans go to the same heaven. Now I know they do. It's wherever love waits patiently in darkness, believing in dawn." Tommy now wears Michael's scarf, teaching new blind cubs the clicking language. Northeast remains their sacred direction, and somewhere beyond sight, a boy, a man, and a lion are finally together, their darkness transformed into eternal light. I need to tell you something I've learned from Thomas and Aurelian's story. We spend so much time believing that family means blood, that love requires proximity, that blindness is only about sight. But that's not true, not even close. Family is the blind lion who remembers your scent after 8 years. It's the brother who finally says, "I was wrong." It's the stranger in Africa who holds a phone to a lion's ear so a dying man can say goodbye. Family is whoever refuses to let you face the darkness alone. Thomas thought he was saving Aurelian, but gratitude works both ways. That blind lion saved 47 other animals, who each saved something in their caregivers, who went home and hugged their children tighter. Gratitude multiplies like that, spreading outward in waves we never see. You know what breaks my heart. We wait until we're dying to say what matters. Thomas and Aurelian couldn't speak the same language, couldn't even see each other, but they never stopped saying, "I remember you." That's all any of us want to be remembered, to matter, to know our love outlives our bodies. Tonight, tell someone their family. Tell them while you still can. Don't wait for satellite connections or deathbed confessions. Love now, love blind.